Okay.
So
That works.
this is very informal, and we're here at my hotel room in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and we've just been at the ICSA conference on psychological abuse and manipulation, and I'm here with Karen Pressley. Hello.
Hi, and
Nice
I'm
to meet
so
you.
glad to finally meet you, and I'm glad I met you here.
Oh, thanks. And Paul Grosswald, who's an old friend and
Good to see you again.
an attorney who's been helping people for a long time get out of cults.
I've been an anti-cult activist for the last 20 years, and
And now you're a barred attorney.
now I'm a
Yay!
lawyer. Right, exactly.
In New York and New Jersey.
In New York and New Jersey, and I'm actually litigating against cults, and I've helped people get some money back from Scientology. So
And not just Scientology, but any cult.
any cult that anyone has a legal problem with, I'm willing to help.
That's really awesome, and I want to help you do that.
Well, great.
In
And
fact-
it was great meeting you today. You had a great presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, it was really great to meet you. It's like we just really connected on where we're going, in our post-Scientology life, and I'm really excited about your goals.
And I really liked your presentation with a former member of the Children of God on the whole issue of hegemonious communication patterns and the difference between healthier communication patterns.
That with Miriam Boeri, I just have to tell you this story. What you don't know is that she and I met at a university. Here we both had traveled the globe. I had traveled with Scientology around the world, and she had done the same with the Children of God. What chance was there that the two of us would end up in a little Georgia university
Wow.
as middle-aged women who had left cults and had become academics, and we're just like powering forward, with a new life that we reconstructed after being in a destructive cult. So that's,
And I might
it
add,
was
she
amazing.
wrote a book called Heaven's Harlots.
She did.
Her Life as a Sacred Prostitute, and you're writing a book that's coming out soon. What's the title going to be?
It's going to be Escaping Scientology: An Insider's True Story. So it's.
Can you share a little bit about how long were you in? A long time, right?
I got into Scientology in 1982, and I got out in 1998. So
Wow.
this August 1st, I'm celebrating my 12th anniversary.
Wow.
Being
Happy
an
anniversary.
Being an ex-Scientologist. I love that. Thank you. But the book, I think I shared with you just a little bit of this, but I tried to get that book out back in 2000 in my first book contract, and of course the Church of Scientology suppressed the publication.
They tried to use some questionable legal tactics to get the book, not to scare the publisher out of
Literally,
publishing.
I mean, that's what you and I immediately connected on. Fabricating a claim that I had signed a confidential document, and then using that as a threat for a publisher to be culpable in a lawsuit. That's so over the top.
Yep. And may I add, just interject and say, information control is one of the 4 major mind control techniques.
Indeed.
Cults don't want former members to tell their story.
Right, the cult's not just using information control on people in the group, but they use information control on the public by preventing the public from hearing the stories of the former members.
That's exactly it. I mean, when you think about it, they didn't want my story told because, who wants anybody to talk about having been in the entertainment business in Hollywood, and then you get lured into Scientology, and then you work under the management and tell the story of what you saw on the recruitment of celebrities and how
Weren't you in
celebrities are
charge of the
manipulated.
Celebrity Center itself?
Ironically, for a short time, I was, for almost 2 years, about a year and a half, I
That's
joined.
not a short time.
Not a short,
My
especially in
window of
Scientology
reality.
years. But when I was at Celebrity Center with Peter, we were recruiting celebrities.
That's your husband, right?
My
Ex-husband.
ex-husband,
Ex-husband.
my husband then. And we were recruiting celebrities into Scientology during those years. And then when I signed the billion-year contract, committing
'Cause
my
of the
life
Sea Org.
and future lifetimes to the Sea Org, I became the commanding officer of the Celebrity Center network. So what went from being a really creative, fun, innovative, not hobby, but just lifetime pastime of, doing artistic things, got turned into a really high duress, hammer and pound job of being a commanding officer of you must get this many celebrities recruited into Scientology, and it has to happen now or you're going to go to the RPF. So it was done under duress. And But I weathered the storm at Celebrity Center and then went up to international management, where I ultimately worked under David Miscavige on special projects. And having been a fashion designer in my career before Scientology, they used that skill, and I was responsible for staff image. So there I was, making staff look good, just so that Scientology could be accepted around the world and raise the income. So it was all about money.
So you helped to design their outfits?
Yeah, you know, Scientology is known for its pseudo-military style. And my job was to, like in Clearwater, Florida, get rid of the pseudo-military look, which scared people away, and put them into a tropical clothing that was more comfortable for the townspeople so they didn't stand out. And that was my job.
I always thought the purpose of the military clothes was to keep people tightly controlled, but I guess they figured out we can still control the people without having the uniforms, make it look so intimidating.
And it's
right?
funny you're saying that, because that is the policy of the uniforms. It's for authority. It's to maintain authority on people.
So I need to ask you worked under David Miscavige. I presume you watched the Anderson Cooper show?
I did.
So, because...
I've got to comment on something.
Please.
On the Anderson Cooper show, what stood out to me the most was when the wives were up on the platform and they were refuting Jenny DeVock and Kathy Rinder specifically refuting the claims that were being made about Mike Rinder claiming and Marty Rathbun claiming and Tom DeVock claiming that Miscavige had physically abused them, hit them, beat them up. And they were refuting the claim by saying, I'm Tom's wife. I know every inch of his body. And why is it that I never saw a bruise? And why he never told me that? And I was just like, I can't believe she's saying this, because Jenny DeVock lived out in the desert in California while Tom DeVock lived in Clearwater, Florida.
Oh.
And David Miscavige was down in Clearwater most of the time. In fact, while the whole Lisa McPherson case was going on, which David Miscavige personally ran, by the way, Tom DeVock was one of the commanding officers at FLAG. Jenny DeVock wouldn't have a clue what David Miscavige was doing to Tom's body because she wasn't there. And there she was on CNN telling this massive lie.
It was, TRL, isn't it? She was probably rehearsed.
TR0.
TR0. Right.
Keeping them. And Kathy Rinder, same thing with Mike Rinder. Mike Rinder was the commanding officer of OSA, which is located in Los Angeles. Kathy Rinder lived out in the desert 2 hours away. They would go for weeks without seeing each other. So how would she know what Mike's body had bruises on it? It was such a subterfuge.
Yeah, but they also said they know David Miscavige and he would never do anything like that.
Absolutely.
Did you ever have anything you want to say about?
That's an interesting question, and I gotta say, to some degree, that is painful to talk about, because to recall those memories of seeing him slam I've seen him slam people against a wall by the neck, by the shoulders. I've been in the hallway. Ray Midoff, who was the senior CS International, his office was across from mine when I was the International Management Public Relations Officer. We were in the Del Sol building. And Ray Midoff was constantly under the gun with David Miscavige. And I was present once when he threw Ray Midoff against the wall and took his shirt and, threw him up like this and told him he was an SP and a piece of shit and made him get on his hands and knees and just humiliated him. And right after that, Ray Midoff was sleeping in a tent on a hillside and having to pee outdoors with no toilet facilities and cleaning floors with toothbrushes. He was just, Miscavige used every psychological tactic, physical abuse, verbal abuse, to dehumanize.
Now, Steve, since you're the mind control expert, so can I just ask you to briefly explain why would people stay in that kind of environment when there's that much abuse taking place?
Well, I was in the Moonies, as you may know. Maybe you don't know, but and my website is freedomofmind.com, and I wrote 2 books about the subject of my experience in the Moonies and such. Basically, brainwashing and mind control exists, and people get deceptively recruited into totalistic organizations, not knowing what's really going to happen to them, and their mind gets twisted and they get split into a cult identity that suppresses their real identity, and they're trained to thought stop any negative thoughts against the leader, the doctrine, or the organization. They're given phobias that if they ever leave, they're going to go insane, or they're going to get cancer, or they're going to become a drug addict or commit suicide. I have chapter 10 of my second book is on phobias, and I have 4 pages, single-spaced, of the most
Tell me
common.
again the title of your second book.
Releasing the Bonds,
Okay.
Empowering People to Think for Themselves.
That's on my reading stack. I read
And
your
you read the first one.
I read your first book, but I don't want to interrupt your
No, that's fine, but
Okay.
the answer is that no person in volitional control of reality and of the mind-body experience would ever allow a crime like that to be committed and not be appalled and run away or call the police or something like that, much less go on an international television show and lie about it.
Exactly.
But lying is a major piece of mind control cults, and I guess I don't want to spend a long time talking about that because I could talk about it for hours.
Right.
But I guess I want to celebrate the fact that you were in so high up in so long, and you've really recreated your life, and you're now an academic, and you teach story writing and editing, right? And what else? Talk a little bit about your presentation on communication.
Okay. Before I answer that question,
Oh,
I
okay.
do just want to say that it was about 2 years after I got out of Scientology. I got out in 1998, and it was about 2 years, and I discovered your book on the internet. I was literally afraid to surf the internet because while I was in Scientology, we were forbidden to ever access the internet under threat of going to the RPF. And so
That's
when
the phobias that Steve was talking
Oh.
about.
Yeah.
And so when I got out of
But
Scientology,
in the case of being in and being threatened to go to the RPF, that's not a phobia. It's a real
it's a
Right,
real,
it's a real threat.
It's a
Based
very
on-
real threat.
Right.
right, based on real punishment. And
But interesting, 2 years later, I have this awareness one day. I can access the internet, but it took me a while to come to the reality that I had the freedom to do that. I think it takes people different lengths of time to realize. I mean, it was about a week after I got out of Scientology that, believe it or not, I took pleasure in staying in a hotel that had scented soap, because for my entire Scientology life, I'd been prevented from ever using scented products. And one day I was in a store and realized I could buy scented soap. I could buy scented detergent. Just a little simple pleasure like that made a huge impact on just regaining my autonomy.
I just want to
autonomous
add
thinking.
in, when I left the Moonies, they had so indoctrinated me with fears of women, even though I have 2 older sisters and my best friends before the Moonies were all
Wow.
women.
Wow.
It took me a year before I could kiss a woman and not hear chapter 2 lecture
Right.
in my head.
Out 2D.
and have, this panic phobic response.
Wow.
It took a full year for me, and I was
Full year.
only in 2.5 years. I mean,
Wow.
when I hear about being involved for 18 years, I'm
Oh
like,
man.
whoa.
So here I am, surfing the internet, and I had this sense of fear, clicking on certain links, like, what would that show me? Was something going to happen to me when I read it? I mean, crazy stuff built in your thoughts. And anyway, I stumbled upon your book, and I bought a copy on the internet, used, and I read your book,
I was combating cult mind control.
Combating Cult Mind Control. And what year did you write that book?
1988.
You wrote it in '88. I read it in about '99 or 2000. So when I read that book, I just couldn't put it down. I couldn't believe that you were giving an account of what happened to you with the Moonies, and you had collected your wits and got your sense about you to sort of make sense of the experiences.
Oh, I was rescued. My family
I read that
rescued
story.
me. And one of the women
It's
I
an
recruited
amazing
was
story.
part of the team who rescued me. So, I mean, I think that's a major motivation for the last 35 years or so why I've been helping other people get out.
Well, see,
It's
that,
because someone helped me get out, and I didn't want to be in, if I think about being in 18 years or 20 years or 30 years, I have friends who are still in the Moonies. And they're married to people they don't love with kids, and they're miserable,
yeah.
and they have no skills, and they have no education. And it's, shocking.
Yeah, I lost my husband Peter to that. We had been married 21 years, and because of the Scientology disconnection policy, and specifically because of David Miscavige, to note, Peter and I got divorced. But back to
Just to point out, that's the same disconnection policy that Scientology denied they have on the Anderson Cooper show a few weeks ago.
As a matter of fact, weren't you gonna point out the fact that Scientology's lawyer said on CNN to Anderson Cooper that they don't practice disconnection?
Right. What she said was that people don't like being around people who criticize their religion, so they voluntarily choose to disconnect, but we don't tell them. The church doesn't tell them to disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a book about Scientology ethics with a chapter in it titled Disconnection,
Oh yeah.
where they are telling people to disconnect.
I know that
Whoops.
policy really well.
Whoops.
It's impossible to deny that it exists.
Right.
So how do you go as an attorney? How do you go on national TV and tell?
Well, I believe it's an ethics
blatant-
violation. I believe it's an ethics violation, and we'll see if the DC disciplinary board has anything to say to that
Question,
particular
is he a member?
Good
The
question.
attorney?
Is he a believer?
It was a female attorney,
Oh,
Monique
she-
Yingling.
Okay. Monique
and-
Yingling said.
And I don't know if she's a member or not, but it's irrelevant because she's representing a client and she's not allowed to lie to third parties in the course of a representation.
Right, because it would make more sense to me that she would lie being a member, because, she's protecting...
Right.
But for purposes of the ethics rules, it makes no difference.
Right,
And-
but
and
most
that's-
groups think they're above the law.
Right,
Hence
exactly.
their long track record of violating the law.
Right.
Well, that fits with the Scientology mentality that the end justifies the means. To her, it's acceptable to lie to protect Scientology's image.
Mhm.
But, the internet has become their worst enemy because, their lies and their news is being exposed and they can't control it anymore.
Right.
So,
It's the enemy of any totalitarian group
exactly.
because they want to do information control. They
Exactly.
don't want people to talk to former members and critics and think for themselves and make their own decisions. And so to the extent they can phobiatize people to stay away, that's one thing, or not allow them access to computers, that's another way.
Exactly.
But my experience is that people deep down inside want to know the truth. And they want to be free. And they want to feel love and be loved.
Absolutely.
And in an environment like a totalitarian cult run by a narcissistic, psychopathological leader, megalomaniac, you're not going to not only not feel love, you're going to feel terrorized and,
Yeah. In
helpless.
fact, speaking of terrorized, I started using the term psychological terrorism in some of the writings that I'm doing about Scientology. That very term. But when we were talking about the internet, I was thinking about you, Paul, because what are you started to tell me, and we didn't really get to talk about this, but what are some of the ways that you were sort of thinking about using the internet to help Scientologists who are attempting to recover and rebuild their lives and recoup maybe some of the money that they've lost?
Well, I think what we need is to bring together all the information pertaining to the law and cults, and maybe have a blog that addresses those issues, because it's very difficult to sue a cult. I mean, they hide under the First Amendment. They claim to have freedom of religion. So you need to have ways of circumventing the religious freedom argument and going after them and holding them accountable for their bad behavior. And that requires that we have lawyers who can survey the case law, who can find statutes that are applicable and find cases that have gone in favor of a cult victim, and bring it together to a single place so that attorneys
That's a great idea.
so that attorneys who want to sue a cult will have a resource to go to, sort of like a library of the law as it pertains to cults. I mean, there are
But
blogs,
not only Scientology.
all cults.
Hopefully, and anything revolving around undue influence.
Right,
hopefully.
and there are a number of blogs that deal with religion and the law. A lot of them deal with issues like separation of church and state, and issues of religious tax exemption or things like that. But they don't necessarily focus on what do you do when you have a victim of a cult. And of course, not all cults are religious anyway.
Exactly.
So I think we need to have a resource on the internet that focuses specifically on issues that cult victims are concerned about in terms of their legal rights.
Like social influence.
Well, if
Right.
you need help setting that up, call on me.
You got it. You
We'll
got it.
all
Because I would love
talk
to do
off
it.
camera.
Right.
Stay tuned.
So well, let's just get back to the presentation that you did today. I
Yeah,
think
that's what I would like
Yeah.
you
Right.
to say a little bit about.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
it was neat, and people need to know there is life after long-term cult involvement. That
Yeah.
you can
And you did a-
actually
It
be
truly
free.
is.
You did a great job of explaining how, you actually had escaped 3 times from Scientology, and the
Right.
first 2 times you got pulled back in.
Right.
And you did a great job of explaining how, you were in different places at different times. And
Yeah.
that was very insightful.
Different places in terms of my thinking process, and that's what that presentation was about. But I'm going to segue into that answer by playing off your book, because when you got out of the Moonies, and you rebuilt your life, you actually began to help people, became a counselor. But what you did was you wrote your story. And, I really believe, since being out of Scientology, I've become a communication specialist, and my undergraduate work was in that. Now I'm finishing my master's in writing and editing. And your book helped me tremendously. So had you not given the narrative of your story, I couldn't have benefited from it. And that's where I'm at in terms of communication, narrative, etc. So one of the things that I do with my company that I formed, CAP Communications, is, I have written several, I have worked as a ghostwriter to help people to write their story who have a story to tell but they can't write, or they don't have the time to write. Maybe they're really consumed with rebuilding a life or running a business or whatever, but and they can tell a story on tape, but they can't sit down and write a nonfiction book. So that's one of the things that I do.
Great, wonderful thing.
We had a conference here today at ICSA about memoir and the power of memoir. And I think
Well, there's a whole thing of narrative therapy.
Narrative
helping
therapy.
people to
Narrative
tell their
therapy.
story.
Yeah. And it, for me, you asked me about my presentation and what I'm doing. For me, coming out of Scientology, the 2 things that have helped me to recover is, number 1, my college education, because that enabled me to get rid of all the false information that I had absorbed about Scientology.
So you went back to college after you got out of Scientology?
After I got out of school.
Oh, I see. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I
after-
didn't realize that.
I did.
Good for you. So you did undergraduate and graduate.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Since I've been out.
All right.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, the whole sense of learning, as I studied philosophy, political science, English literature, you touch on concepts like totalist thinking. And, when you learn political science, you're learning about everything from fascism to communism. And I found Scientology as a organizational structure. So learning it about political science. College education is one thing that Scientology really discourages. They don't want you to go to college. They say it's a waste of money, that degrees mean nothing. Well, why are they telling people that? It's because they don't want people to get educated and really develop their critical thinking skills.
It's because Hubbard got a D in physics.
And
he said
never-
he was a nuclear physicist. I'm sorry
And by
for
the way,
interrupting.
David Miscavige did not graduate from high school. Now, he might have gotten something elsewhere after that, but they're
I'm
not,
sorry for interrupting.
they're not
I
big on
couldn't-
education, on outside education.
Right.
They believe that
They want you to
only-
learn what they're teaching you and
Yeah.
not what anybody else is teaching.
Only Scientology education has value. And that's another,
That's what they say.
don't you agree that that's another mind control technique?
Yeah, Lifton called the sacred science. That
Yeah.
any totalistic group claims that they have the ultimate information that solves all of life's problems, all of issues, explains everything, and therefore to question that is to be unscientific.
There you go. And
Or
interesting.
ungodly or unspiritual
Or right,
or
if it's,
whatever.
Yes.
if it's
Yes.
a more religious-oriented cult.
And several of us who have come out of Scientology have gone back to college and become academics, such as Bruce Hines is now, I think he's in the Colorado area and is in engineering, and I think he even teaches at university. And that's the direction I've taken. Because it helped me to make sense of my experiences, and it gave me new things to grab onto. And what I talked about today, you're asking me about my presentation. In looking at what happened to me and what I have seen happen to other people, because I've been contacted by hundreds of ex-cult members, different groups. It's very clear to me that in an organization that's totalist, where the power in the communication is not equal, like you and I, us three are speaking equally, we're exchanging ideas. We're not controlling each other's thoughts. We're not censoring anything that we're saying, and we're listening, and we're understanding, and we're exchanging.
Right.
In a totalist environment like Scientology, it's a top-down communication. It's totalist. So I developed a communication model because I wanted to offer people a tool that they could use to help see what happens in a cult. A lot of people look at it, look at cults from the perspective of like religious studies, cultic studies and stuff, and that's all great and valid. But being a communication specialist, I see some really strong needs for people to understand what happens to the individual's creativity in a totalist environment. It's utterly suppressed to the extent that a leader such as David Miscavige dictates your every move, and there is no room for original thought. There's no room for creativity. My ex-husband Peter, who is still there, was an incredibly talented composer. He wrote "On the Wings of Love" in 1982. That song is still played around the world.
It's a great song.
Great song. It was nominated for a Grammy. So here you have this Grammy-nominated composer who had an incredibly creative mind, beautiful works of art and music. And here he is behind the fences of Scientology, and his creativity is being dictated every moment, 24/7, by David Miscavige, who says, you need to write this, and it needs to be done according to L. Ron Hubbard's policy about writing music. And then that music, basically, Peter would never get praise or approval for the work he did. All of that recognition would go to L. Ron Hubbard for the technology that is used to train and control the Scientologists. Yeah. So, where's the creativity?
Don't you think he's going to wake up and leave?
I've been hoping for that for many years, and if he left tomorrow and contacted me, my husband, Greg, I've remarried, and Greg has told me that he would welcome Peter in the house because,
he's a very secure
He's
man.
a very secure man. He's a very secure man. Yeah. I really lucked out. I found a really great guy.
Good for you. So that's another positive comment about life moving on.
It really is, Steve. And, one thing that really hung around my neck when I first got out of Scientology, and I'd like to hear your thoughts, Paul, because you were in the Sea Org here in New York.
Only very briefly, though.
Very briefly, but enough to impact your life to where you're now dedicating yourself to helping people.
That's true. Yeah.
One of the things that you get told if you think about leaving the Sea Org, L. Ron Hubbard wrote a specific policy that says, if you leave the Sea Org, you are a degraded being, and that you'll never make it.
Right.
Because you've turned in your keys to your eternity. They hold the keys to your eternity. So when you
That's
leave
a
the
good
Sea Org,
example of a phobia.
Right. Exactly.
By the way, totally irrational
Totally
belief.
irrational. Totally nuts.
Yeah.
So you get out of the Sea Org and you think, I'll never make it, and you've got this noose around your neck that's totally mental.
Yeah, it's an imaginary noose.
An imaginary noose.
Although
doesn't
interesting,
exist.
although you want to hear something interesting.
And you're working to
believe it.
disprove it all the time.
Right. When I actually got kicked out of the Sea Org because my parents were doing an intervention and causing problems, and they had shown me some of the secret information I wasn't supposed to see.
OT3.
So I got kicked out of the Sea Org, and I actually, as
that
bad.
must have been an interesting experience. experience.
Well, I mean, as bad as I felt about, all the, my life being ruined now that I wasn't in the Sea Org, I also felt a little bit relieved, like, oh, I don't have to,
Spend the billionaires.
I don't have to follow these rules anymore.
Wow.
So it was kind of this dual experience of the relief and also the, the anger and the guilt of not being able to cut it as a Sea Org member.
Yeah.
And it took me really a full year before I recovered, and but I've made good on it. I've already gotten way more people out of Scientology than I ever recruited when I was in it. So
That's really awesome. And see, you know the communication model we were talking about. I hope that people can read that. It's coming out in a journal article in about 2 months.
Cool.
Through ICSA. It's in a special issue called Cults and Creativity. It's the name of the issue. And the paper that I co-authored with Miriam Boeri, who's from the Children of God,
Right.
we put this together because we wanted people to have a tool to understand communication, getting back to that.
Right.
And that
Are you putting that on your website or
It's-
some elements of
I'm
that
putting
on
a
your
link.
website?
I'm putting a link.
What
to
is
it
your
on there.
website, just in case anyone wants
It's
to check that out?
www.capcom.com. And
Spell it.
Capcom is KAPCOMM.
KAPCOMM.com.
Capcom.com.
Okay.
Karen Pressley. But yes, I have some links to ICSA, to the description of our talk, and I'll put a link to the article once the article's
Because
published.
honestly, when I was watching your presentation with Miriam, I was thinking, this would be really helpful to get people out of other groups than Scientology and the Children of God, because
How
you're
did you
not.
see it that way? Tell me. I'd like
Well,
to get your
because
feedback.
I spend my life helping people get out
Right,
of cults,
right.
and basically the Achilles heel of mind control cult indoctrination is that you're taught to shut out any doubts about your group, your leader, the doctrine, or the organization. But it's fine to have doubts and problems with other groups.
Mhm.
So someone from, let's say, a Bible cult, they know Scientology's a cult, and any group that misuses the Bible and makes women be prostitutes and molest children, that's a
Like
cult
the Children
too.
of God does.
So hearing two intelligent women say, hey, I spent all these years in these two organizations, here's an academic conceptual framework for just analyzing communication. What's healthy, what's not healthy. To me, that's a great thing.
Well, that's great feedback. We
let's put it out and hear from people. But I predict it's going to be very helpful to people.
I really hope so.
Yeah.
There was a man who runs the tell me what this is. It's a Jewish council in New York,
Yeah, it's called the
just-
Cult Clinic.
the Cult Clinic,
Mm-hmm.
and it's run by the Jewish Foundation.
Family and Children's Services.
Well, Arnie
Markowitz.
Arnie Markowitz was in the audience, and
Right.
he came up and spoke to me afterwards and just said I was really pleased to get his feedback. He found that he thought that it was a great contribution to the field in
Yeah.
terms of a new tool that could be used that
Right.
comes in from a different angle.
Angle.
Nobody's
That was what I was
been looking
thinking.
at communication particularly.
Not since Conway and Siegelman wrote Snapping in 1978.
Oh wow!
They were
See, that's not even. I don't know that one, but
well, it's worth checking out.
Yeah.
Historically, they were the first communications expert to kind of examine the cult phenomenon. They explained things in terms of their models. I came to have a problem with their conceptualization that snapping is a good thing to get people out of cults.
okay. I've heard of
And they wrote
snapping,
about
yeah.
Ted Patrick, who's someone I don't
Right, a
particularly like.
deprogrammer. Yeah.
He's the one who founded it, who coined the term, and
Yeah.
he was.
When I was in Scientology, he was always presented
Black
like the
Lightning.
devil incarnate.
Yeah, that when I was in the
Yeah.
Moonies, he was presented as Black Lightning and the Devil
Yeah.
incarnate, and
Right.
it turned out he was basically a fairly uneducated black man who was very streetwise, and who cared a lot and didn't give a crap, if he was going to piss off multi-million-dollar groups, So I think his heart was in the right place, but his methodology was very coarse.
Yeah.
I called it Neanderthal
A little rough.
in terms
I read some stories.
yeah, and so when I got out, even though I was involved with some forcible intervention, some were conservatorship cases with people in the Moonies, It just didn't sit right with me. Even though people left and thanked me, it was because I knew the feeling, because I had broken my leg because I had fallen asleep
I
at the
read
wheel
that
of
in
the
your
van.
book, yeah.
And my father took my crutches away. So I wasn't kidnapped, but I was held
Yeah,
for the
you
first
were
24
kind of
hours
immobilized,
against
actually.
my will. And I
Yeah.
was so angry, and I felt so violated, and I thought Satan was in my family and attacking me and all of that. But I was so fanatical that I basically made a deal with my father that if I stayed and listened for 4 days, he'd drive me back to the group. Because I wanted to prove I wasn't brainwashed and it wasn't a cult. I was that sure of it. And thank goodness the real me was still under there going, this sounds like a cult. It sounds like Chinese communist brainwashing. All the criteria of Lifton fit. You know, we were told when people leave the group they become insane or they become drug addicts or they become unspiritual, and all these ex-members seem like they're really nice, cool, smart, spiritual people. That doesn't make sense either. You know, but that was all subterranean happening. I was still, on the fourth day they showed me a parallel between Adolf Hitler and coming from a Jewish upbringing, educated about the Holocaust. I remember saying, I don't care if Moon is like Hitler. I've chosen to follow him and I'll follow him to the end. And right after I did that, a chill went down my spine. You know, it was like my body, you know, my real mind
Your
was
brain
like
and your
going,
body weren't
what
matching
the
up, yeah."
hell did you just say? You don't care if he's like Hitler? You're going to follow him to the end? Here's a
you
submachine
scare
gun.
yourself?
Go shoot this crowd of people who are SPs.
Well, and the great thing about Steve, though, is that you've developed a more, a less aggressive model for getting people out of cults and for helping families to get people out so that they don't have to go through that same
Yeah,
type of
and I
traumatic
basically
experience.
have developed a communications model to teach people not to confront the cult leader directly, because it's just going to bring alienation and the person's going to feel persecuted. Talk about other groups, you know, talk about things that they would agree on, and lay the foundation for people can have a phobia, for example.
Right.
How can an intelligent person have a phobia of an elevator? What's the structure of that experience that they can't get in an elevator? They'd rather walk 40 floors or not go and do that job interview because they have that kind of irrational fear that the elevator's going to crash, even though it's been safety checked with safety brakes, has a phone in it and everything else. It's the same. If you understand the phobia of an elevator, you can understand how people can stay in a mind control cult when they're miserable. And then if you teach people how to undo a phobia and how to visualize positive future things, how to change the internal dialogue in your head, how to deep breathe, how to do systematic desensitization. It's really about teaching people to take control of their own minds and their lives again. It's like, it's my mind.
Which is interesting. That's exactly what Scientology says that they teach you. Is they teach you how to get control of your mind.
But that's how cults twist things, because it sounds so good, and yet, because he says he dehypnotizes you when he's hypnotizing you.
Right.
Oh no, we don't do hypnosis, but in my opinion, that's what they're doing. A lot of the techniques are hypnotic techniques.
You know, as you're talking about that, I was thinking about before some of the newer cultic studies theory and books have come out, I stumbled upon something from old called the Stockholm Syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that? It's an older, it was like early 70s, and it talks about how the individual who is in a coercive control environment, like a cult, will support the leader even though the individual is being controlled.
Yeah, for me, the Stockholm Syndrome was coined by an individual after people were held hostage in a bank robbery.
Okay.
And after they were liberated, they still liked and visited the robbers.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I've heard the Stockholm Syndrome applied to cults a lot in the media. I don't think so. I
Doesn't
think
work?
Well, I think it's a much more dramatic transformation in a negative way of a person's sense of self.
I mean, the cult is a more
The
dramatic
cult is a
transformation.
much more, it's not just liking the identifying with the abuser in a protective kind of stress moment.
Or no.
When you're in a mind control cult, you're changing your identity, you're changing your beliefs.
Absolutely.
You know, or the bull bite model, controlling behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions. It's much more detailed. So it bothers me when I hear in the media, like when they found J.C. Dugard, who was kidnapped at age 11, found 18 years later. Do you remember that story?
Yeah.
And they were saying, well, how come she didn't tell the police who she was? She was walking around without this perpetrator. And then they were saying it was Stockholm Syndrome. It's like, no, she was kidnapped. Her behavior was controlled. Her information was controlled. Her thoughts were controlled. Her emotions were controlled. She was
So is there a name for, is mind control syndrome a term we can use? Is there a name for the mind control phenomenon?
I wish there was a really snappy, good one.
Well, that's one of the things this conference has been about, too, is the discussion of that, because some people in some camps like to use the word cult and others don't because of who it offends. Some people prefer to use the word brainwashing, while others believe that brainwashing doesn't even happen, doesn't even exist.
Who believes that? Let me talk to them. Just kidding.
Some people, prefer to use thought reform over mind control.
Coercive persuasion and undue influence are also used.
Instead of calling a group a cult, a harmful group a cult, they call it high demand groups, which, in my case, when I got out of Scientology, here's a good thing about books. When I got out of Scientology and had gotten some education, I stumbled upon a book written by Gordon Melton on the Church of
Cultapologist.
Yes.
On the payroll of many different groups. I shouldn't say that.
Now
we know that he's received funds for researching groups that he's writing about. So conflict of interest, I think.
Right.
I hadn't had much education at that point, didn't need it. I had my own common sense to read the book that Gordon Melton wrote. I didn't know anything about Gordon Melton. I just read the book he wrote. And having been a 16-year Scientologist, and then I read Gordon Melton's book. And I'm like, where did this guy get his information? I wasn't involved in cultic studies or anything yet. I was just
You knew he was wrong because it didn't match up with your experience in Scientology?
Absolutely. When I read the book...
Thank you for making the obvious statement. It's like, no.
I'm reading the book and he's talking about the fair game. He makes a statement. He literally comes out and says, the fair game policy was canceled in 1968. And here I am, a CR member working in management that publishes the policies. Well, there was an issue, an order at one time to cancel that policy paper. But the practice of fair game was never canceled. In fact, it was condoned, strategized, planned with campaigns and funds.
Was it called fair game or was it
personnel.
called something else?
No, it was called attacking the SP.
Right.
The fair game name was canceled, but it certainly didn't cancel the tactic.
Right.
And the reality that lots of people were assigned.
Just for people who
to
don't know,
fair
the fair game policy said that a critic of Scientology may be tricked, sued, lied to, or destroyed without any punishment of the Scientologist.
Thank you.
Who does that?
That's excellent.
Right.
And that practice continues to this day. And yet here's Gordon
I've
Melton.
been fair game,
and
I'm not even an ex-Scientologist.
There you go.
Darn.
You're a critic.
I'm sorry.
You troublemaker, you.
I try. To have as much fun as
I'm
possible.
I'm reading Gordon's book, and I'm like, who is this guy who calls himself an authority?
Well, he's also a vampire expert.
Okay, didn't
Three
know
books
that.
on vampires.
I didn't know that either.
Vampire
Okay, that's good to know.
interest.
Just interrupt you. The most blatant thing for me was that when the Om Shinrikyo cult of Japan sarin gassed people in the subways, he flew there and said, "They're innocent. They had nothing to do with it."
I have never heard that story.
Om Shinrikyo flew him over.
Wow, I hadn't
like,
heard that.
hello.
So that corroborates what I was thinking when I was reading this book.
Yep.
And he said that, but he made a statement in there that really opened up my eyes about Scientology, because he said that one of the terms for Scientology's gain of tax-exempt status with the IRS in 1993 was that fair game was canceled. And that just like blew my mind. Because it is such a lie that fair game is canceled.
So they should lose their tax exemption based on that alone.
There's a point,
Yeah.
Right.
in the agreement with the IRS, probably one of many that are violated.
Yeah.
And one of the other points, are all the e-meters, do they all have the statement on them that they're not to be used for diagnostic purposes? That was also one of the terms of the IRS tax exemption.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And yet, well, that's what Gordon says in his book.
Not to mention that lie detectors don't work. Anyway, like real ones.
And they're not supposed to be used.
Police ones don't work.
Right.
And yet, Scientology sells spiritual counseling, and the staff are trained to come up with case supervised CS procedures as remedies for drug addiction, allergies, headaches, all kinds of stuff. And they map out, the plans for that in the folder. So if that isn't like, medical diagnosis, I don't know what is in terms of,
Right.
using for healing. But the e-meters used constantly in auditing for this. So that's another point. Anyway, Gordon Melton's book opened me up to some things that, I wanted to follow up on, and there you are. You can maybe
That's
say
amazing.
that too.
So anyway, we were going to talk for 15 minutes, and
Oh,
I think
wow.
we've done an hour.
Did we?
Uh,
Probably could talk more.
Maybe we can, in the next 5 or 10 minutes, think of whatever you want to say that's we'll put this up on the internet. Any
Well, I'd like to say one thing.
thoughts?
Did I share with you about how the chief legal counsel of the Church of Scientology, Elliot Abelson, contacted both of my publishers?
Right. We talked about that. How
And-
that's a questionable legal tactic to suppress.
Yes.
The-
And I just want to tell, any Scientologists or
Look
ex-Scientologists
to the camera
that
and
might
tell
tune
them.
into this. As a result of this, Elliot Abelson made this claim to both my publishers. On a fraudulent basis, he told them that I had signed the covenant bond when you route out of the church, and you have to sign this $500,000 bond of confidentiality. Well, of course, I left the church on my own terms, and I never signed this bond. And Elliot Abelson wrote me a letter in March of 2006 telling me to stop speaking out in the media. I had done NBC Dateline, CBS Inside Edition, CNN, Los Angeles Times, and they didn't want me to do any more media and not to speak out. And when he found out about the books, he went and contacted Broadman and Hellman in Nashville and New Hope in Birmingham and threatened them with a lawsuit if they published my book. Now, where does a lawyer get off, making a fraudulent claim that A, I had signed this document, which I hadn't, and then used a fraudulent document to base a lawsuit on? And so they suppressed the publication of my book.
Was it a lawsuit or a threat of a lawsuit?
Threat of lawsuit.
Right.
Nothing was filed.
Because they couldn't.
Because they couldn't.
Right.
It was
And-
just the illusion of a lawsuit.
Right.
I just wanted to tell Scientologists who
It's called a
fear-
phobia.
Phobias. Get rid of the phobia. There is just about next to nothing threat that you could ever be held culpable for any documents that you were coerced into signing that were any sort of a bond of confidentiality. Because in the state of California, that probably violates labor laws. Number one, you had no legal representation when you signed the document. You had no legal counsel. You had no one to interpret that for you. And plus,
Anything you
when-
want to say when she's
when,
done on them?
when you're in the state of California,
I'm not familiar with California law. I'm admitted
Okay.
in New York and New Jersey, but I'll
Okay.
certainly look into that and see
Yeah.
if there's a
It's a
way for
significant-
Scientologists to get out of those contracts.
That's why a lot of people don't speak out, is because they think they're culpable to these bonds, like whatever they sign.
But let's keep in mind, though, that Jerry Armstrong is still being held to a contract that he signed with Scientology, and he actually is not allowed to come back to the United States, because if he does, he'll go to jail for contempt because he violated a confidentiality agreement. Which
He's
is
one
being,
of my personal heroes, and I'm on a quest to bring Jerry back to the U.S.
But
Right.
that document that he signed is different, and that was done during a legal procedure,
Right.
These documents that I'm talking about is while you're in the employment, you're
Okay.
just this little minion Sea Org member, and you're signing documents to say, I won't talk about this or I won't talk about that. And the point of that is in the state of California, an employer cannot bind an employee to confidentiality unless there's some economic issues related to that. And I could provide that information. In fact, I will put it on my website.
Okay.
I will document that conversation that I had with 2 different California attorneys. And so that's something that Scientologists do not have to fear in terms of speaking out.
That's great to know.
And we need more people speaking out.
And it will go
Yeah.
in your archive of legal research.
Exactly.
Yeah, we'll
right.
put that on your
Put that on the legal blog.
on your
when
legal
we
blog
create it,
when,
yeah.
when you get that
That's
created.
a great
So,
idea.
yeah.
Is there anything you would like to say before
Well,
we
just
wrap up?
I just want to reiterate that if any former Scientologists or former cult members out there are not sure about your legal rights, feel free to contact me. My email address is pgrosswald@hotmail.com. And a very important point I want to make is that very often when a person comes out of a cult, including Scientology, they don't realize what's happened to them for a few years after. And the problem with the law is that there's a statute of limitations, meaning that if you're going to sue the cult for damages, you have to do it within a certain amount of time. But very often the person coming out...
Does that vary by state?
It varies by state. It varies by
Okay.
state, and it varies by the different types of causes of action that you might bring.
Okay.
And so it can be anywhere from 1 year to 2 years to 3 years to 6 years. And what happens is a person very often doesn't get to the point where they recover from the cult and realize what's happened to them so that they can then bring the lawsuit. They don't get to that point until after the statute of limitations has expired. So they end up losing the opportunity to get justice. And so if there's anybody out there watching this, if you think that you might be a victim of a cult, don't sit on your rights.
3 years.
Right.
Find out
Don't
what's
hesitate
up.
to speak up about it.
Exactly,
Seek
or
counsel.
contact a lawyer
Yeah.
because your time might be running out and you might need to move quickly.
And
And
I would just add that a lot of cults don't want to go to trial or court, that they'll, with a lawyer letter and a threat of a suit, they'll often make a settlement, right?
Right. I mean, a lot of cults don't want their secrets to come out in public. Now, in the case of Scientology, the OT3 stuff has already come out. So,
Right.
but other cults that still have secrets that they want to hide,
Right.
you might have some leverage over them.
Right, you
Yeah.
wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and added to that, for people who do come out, who want to tell their story, but you feel that you can't write, whether it's for emotional or mental reasons, just building life back again. I really want to help people write their story, and that's one of the reasons why I'm getting my degree in writing, is so that I can help people do that, to get their book out. Look at the effect your book had in my life. So I want to help people do that.
Cool. And I guess since we're mentioning things that we can do, if you are struggling with phobias or any kinds of relational issues, or you have a loved one still in a cult and you want to have some consultation with me about advice on what you might do or not do to help a loved one or recover in Boston, my website is freedomofmind.com, and I wrote the Combating Cult Mind Control and Releasing the Bonds.
And hopefully you'll be able to see Escaping Scientology and Insider's True Story.
Yay.
Yay!
Thank you. I'm going
Thank
to turn
you.
it off now.
That was fun.